Today we are learning about form. Form is one of your elements of art, and it has to do with an object being three-dimensional, taking up space, having length, width, and height. When we create artworks and we want to have the illusion of depth, we also refer to that as form. My paper is obviously two-dimensional. It's flat. It has length and width, but there's no depth to it whatsoever. It's just a flat sheet of paper. So I can shade my objects to make them look like the light is hitting them and they have volume and they reflect the light to show that. And when you have that, there is what's called the 5 principles of shading. And those 5 principles include the 5 major areas of an object that is lit up by a light source, because without light we don't see anything, so there has to be light, and that's what shows us that things are three-dimensional. So in this example we have a sphere, because remember, a circle is a flat shape. A sphere is shaded, it has form, it's three-dimensional. We have a light source. The light is shining from up here in our top right corner onto our sphere. This lightest part closest to our light source is the first principle of shading, and that's called the highlight. It's always the lightest part, and it's always closest to the light source. Notice that our highlight is round, just like our sphere. Generally, your shading takes on the shape of the form that you're shading. So something that is round is going to have curved lines to create the shading. The highlight will also be round. This next area, and these are very divided right now, we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but this next area is called light, or also called the shade, transitional light. Any of those are fine. I usually call it the transitional light, but in this example that I found on the internet, it's called the light. This is where you have those medium values that kind of show that the area over here is a little bit farther from the light source than the highlight is. So it's curving around and getting farther from the light source, creating that sense of depth. The next area is called the core shadow. Over here, these darker areas on our object, core meaning part of the object, they create this darkness where the circle itself, that sphere, is round. So the light's not reaching this far side of our object. And again, that's our core shadow. Core meaning like part of the whole. After that, we have what's called our cast shadow. Our sphere is not just floating in space. He's sitting on this white platform of sorts. And the light is shining down from here on the top right, hitting our sphere, and that means that the light is shining onto the platform where the light is not blocked by the sphere itself, but the sphere itself does block some of the light and creates what's called a cast shadow. Cast shadows, again, take on the form of the object from which the shadow comes from. So if this were a vase instead of a sphere and it had a tall section that came up here that was kind of cylindrical, then the shadow would have the same. The length of the shadow is determined by how high or low your light source is. In the middle of the afternoon, if you go stand outside, you have very little shadow because the sun is right over your head. But in the late afternoon or towards evening, while the sun is starting to set lower on the horizon, the shadow is longer because of the way the light hits you. It's like a three-dimensional, almost like playing pool. You got to think about where you're going to hit the ball so that it's going to shoot at an angle and hit into the hole. So you have your cast shadow. The edges of the cast shadow, how bold the cast shadow is also determined by the light. If you have a really strong light source, then you're going to have a really bold shadow. If you have multiple light sources, you might have multiple shadows. If you have one light source that's kind of lighter over here and then this guy that's stronger over here, then your shadow might have softer or fuzzier edges. So it really just depends. There is no concrete rule about what your shadow should look like, except that it is opposite your light source and it takes on the shape of the object, coming straight from the base of it. Also on the base of the object is what's called the reflected light, and that's your last of your 5 principles of shading. The reflected light, and once you're aware of that it's there, you may actually start noticing it on things. The reflected light is when the light source is shining down on this platform that our sphere is sitting on. A little bit of that light bounces off of the platform and reflects onto the base of our sphere. So there's a slight, subtle highlight just along the edge right near where the shadow would be that helps to make our object look more realistic, like it's actually sitting on this surface and that it actually takes up space. So again, your 5 principles of shading, to summarize, you have your light source shining down on your object. Closest to that light source, you have a highlight. That highlight blends into the areas that are a little bit farther from your light source, called the light, transitional light. Transitional light fades off farther away from the light source to the core shadow, where the light doesn't reach quite as well around the object, the core shadow. The light on the surface for which the object is sitting, the cast shadow, the light that is blocked. So the cast shadow is opposite your light source. And then again, your reflected light is where your light source is shining onto the surface and reflecting back onto the base of the object. So just a subtle highlight for the reflected light. So one of the things that I just mentioned was that I wanted to come back and talk about how divided those blends were. When you want something to look realistic, you're not going to have a hard edge that divides the highlight from the shade, from the transitional light, from the cast shadow and the core shadow. There's not going to be hard edges on the object itself. It's going to be smoothly blended. Your lines, again, take on the shape of the object. So a sphere is going to have curved lines. Blend those edges together so that you don't have a hard contrast from one value to the next. It should smoothly blend from really dark to really light to make those core shadows and highlights. So again, we're not going side to side, getting rough lines, and then doing a patch that's a little bit lighter, and a patch that's a little bit lighter than that, and then leaving our highlight white, because that doesn't look realistic. We want to keep pencil going with the direction that the curve goes. With spheres, I usually turn my wrist and let it do what it does naturally. It's unnatural to have your wrist turned around this way and be trying to make these curved lines that go in this weird direction. So let it be natural. Turn your paper if you need to get those curved lines. But always think about where your light source is. Again, we don't want to see a division. A lot of students like to draw out the highlight and then draw out the shade and leave that last part to be the core shadow and then fill in those values. And then you can still see this line that differentiates between the different parts of the highlights and the shadows. We don't want to see that. We want it to be blended and smooth. And the last thing that a lot of students do, mostly students who are trying to rush and get through things, is they just turn their pencil on the side and they shade up and down, going across, so that their sphere has a dark side and a light side. That doesn't make it look three-dimensional. That doesn't give it form. That just gives it a dark side and a light side. You have that shape, that curved shape going around the sphere in this instance, to make it look like the light's actually hitting it and it's three-dimensional. So remember, you want to have, if your shape is a sphere, you want to have a sphere-shaped or a circular highlight. You want curved shading that goes around to create your transitional light and your core shadow. So when we work on our value scale, or not value scales, I'm sorry, your shading booklet, which is our next assignment that I want you to really take your time and do a good job on. We have lots of practice with spheres. We have a light source here that you're going to use to determine where your lights and your shadows should be. On the next page, we have some other shapes, some cones, cubes, cylinders, and then lastly, we have an example with a still life of some fruit on a plate, on a dish towel of some sort, And I want you to, using your light source, shade that to look three-dimensional, thinking about where your highlights would be, where your shadows would be. So you're taking what we've practiced doing with these abstract shapes and turning it into something a little more realistic. So for our spheres, we're going to practice doing one of each of these together. Hopefully my pencil will make it through this. If my light source is here, and you're welcome to draw this on there if it helps. I'm going to draw an arrow. Closest point on my sphere to my light source. Remember, that's going to be my highlight. I don't need to do anything with it except keep it a light value. I'm going to turn my pencil on its side and start adding in, using my wrist curve, darker values to create the core shadow. I'm leaving just a little highlight along the edge so that it's easier to add in my reflected light. And I'm gradually going around, blending these values together. I like to kind of add a medium value to begin with. Curve it kind of like a horseshoe around the shape of the sphere. And get smooth, clean blending all the way around. And then I like to layer on to make the darker shade blend into that core shadow. And again, the greater the contrast in value that you use, the more three-dimensional your shape is going to look. So I have right now my highlight closest to my light source, my transitional light or shade as it blends into my core shadow, the darkest area farthest from the light source. I left behind a little highlight along the base over here that is my reflected light. My light source is just over my shape and up slightly to the side, so I'm going to have a curved shadow that comes opposite the light source straight from the base of my object, and I'm just going to pretend that my object is sitting on a surface to add that in. So for you, I want you to keep going. Finish the rest of these spheres. We're going to do a couple shapes each day until we finish, but for the purpose of this video, I'm going to keep going so that you can see it all at one time and we can replay as needed. So again, we have our spheres finished. I have done the whole shading booklet and I've got it in something shiny so it may not show up. And I've labeled different stuff that I want you to remember. Make sure you include all 5 basic values: solid white, light gray, medium gray, dark gray, black, so that you're getting that full range of values and creating dimension. You're using smooth shading so that it looks realistic. You're blending your values together so it goes from that solid white to solid black with no hard lines dividing them. And you're using all 5 principles of shading. So we have a highlight closest to our light source. We have the shade or transitional light. We have the core shadow as we get farthest from the light source. We have that slight highlight at the base of our object that's called the reflected light. And we have our cast shadow opposite our light source to look as though they're sitting on a surface. Our next shape in our booklet are cubes. These can be really simple. Students tend to make them really complicated and think, okay, my cube's at an angle and my light source is here. Welcome to get tricky if you want, but you can also keep it really basic. If my light source is here, then this is going to be the lightest side of my cube. We're going to stick with a high key light value. I'm looking at it, I'm thinking the way that this cube is turned, that this is probably going to be my next darkest side. So I'm going to use a medium range value to fill this one in. And then I feel like, based on where my light source is, that this is probably going to be my darkest side. So I'm going to use a dark value. So to keep my shading smooth, I'm just going to go across my shape and add in a smooth value. I want you to keep it neat. I want you, oh, you can see my other one through there. I hope that doesn't make it too difficult to see what I'm doing here. I want you to keep it smooth. Erase out anything that goes outside of your box so it looks neat. The grade for this, because it's a hard assignment and it's time consuming, is pretty hefty. So do your best work. If you want, you can go back over it with your pencil in the other direction to make it smoother if you feel like you have some lines that are a little scratchy. So I've got a light value closest to my light source. I'm going to add that medium value that we talked about on this side. I tend to use my fingernail as a medium in my pencil from going over so that it helps keep my paper a little cleaner. Fortunately, this looks like it's looking a little smoother on the camera than it is in real life because I want you guys to make it as smooth as you possibly can, and I'm trying to be quick. So hopefully you can get the point without me having to spend too much time showing you each individual shape. Now this side I feel like darkest because it's farthest from my light source. And again, we're just going in lines that accentuate the shape of the original object. I'm going to go horizontal and vertical because I want this to layer on and get much darker values. If I had a shadow of this guy, I don't know, he'd be doing some weird stuff. So my light source is over here. My shadow is going to be opposite him. I almost can't even really picture how he would be. I guess it's a he. He could be a she. Just give me an idea that you understand where your shadow is in relation to your light source, and I'm cool with that for right now. We're talking about abstract shapes that we're pretending are three-dimensional but are on a so, and this is where my students who truly understand this three-dimensional nature start to get confused because they see the light source here and they're asking, but is the light source in front of the object? Is it directly above the object? Is it behind the object? And I'm going to leave that up to you to decide. I can look at your shapes and tell what you were thinking if you're starting to get kind of complex like that, and I can tell whether your shading is correct based on where your highlights and your shadows are. So that's really all I'm looking for. For our cones, a lot of students just want to go straight across with the cone. Avoid that urge. Your cones are three-dimensional. We want to make them look that way. You are welcome to pretend that this is closed or an open cone. It's up to you. So if my light source was here, pointing towards my cone, I'm going to pretend that my cone is closed. So this area is going to be kind of a lighter. It's very close to the light source. You don't have to get complex and say, oh, but it's darker here because it's farther from the light source. You can, but you don't have to. Also, something to think about, if you're imagining these are open, the closer to the light source it's going to be lighter, but as it goes down into this cone shape, you're going to have darker values. So if you like the idea of making this guy look open, keep that in mind. I usually encourage students to shade the shape as it is shaped, if you will. So a cone has a point here, and it kind of fans outward along the shape to give it that three-dimensional quality. Sometimes it is appropriate to shade a cone going this way and add a little curve to it. Kind of depends on where your light source is. But if you want to keep it simple, stupid, which is probably our best bet if you're not confident yet, as new artists, go the length of the cone. So we're going to have a little bit of a shadow over here along this edge that starts off skinny and kind of gets wider as it goes down because it's three-dimensional. So even if our light is on that side, we're still seeing a little bit of that edge that's twisted away from the light source. So then it can fade into our highlight. And then our highlight can start to transition into that transitional light or shade that gives us our overall value. And as it goes across, it gets darker into the core shadow. And again, just like with the cubes, we're kind of just throwing in a shadow to suggest that we understand where it would be if these were real three-dimensional objects. So I've left a little bit over here to make it look like it is sitting on a surface and has a reflected light. And our shadow would be opposite the source. Again, I just want to see an idea that you understand where it is. It looks better if you put some effort into it, but definitely show me that you understand where the shadow, the cast shadow would be. Lastly, we have, they're called cylinders. Our light source is here, same as with the cones. You can imagine that this is open, or you can envision it as being a flat surface. I'm going to pretend that this one is open because on the cones, I pretended it was solid. So closer to the light source, if the light source is right next to it, shining down into it, it's going to be lighter at the top. I'm curving my lines to make it look like it's and getting darker as I get closer to the rim of the can. I'm calling it a can. The cylinder shape where you would no longer see because it's blocked by this side of it. Just like with our cones, everybody wants to get tricky and curve this way. Again, that's always going to depend on your light source and your object. You can just go horizontal along the length of the cylinder. We're always going to have some shading on the side, just like with the cone, because the object is three-dimensional. So even if our highlight is closest to this area here, it's going back around and farther from our site, and the light is not hitting it as much over there. So it's going to be a pinch darker. So we have our transition. It fades into our highlight. I think I want to make him a little darker because more contrast makes it look more dimensional. And then we have more transitional light. It's getting darker. Blending, layering on the values so that we get that core shadow to make it look dimensional. Make sure you come all the way down, otherwise it just looks incomplete. And then we have a cast shadow to show that our object is sitting on a surface, that the light shining on the surface is being blocked by the object itself. For your last one, the still life, let me show you my example. Your light source is here at the top. It shines down on each of these pieces of fruit. So do not take your pencil and say, okay, we're lighter up here at the top, shade all the way across, darker here at the bottom, done. These are all individual shapes. They each have their own form. So this, I think, apple is going to have its own highlight. It's going to have its own transitional values. It's going to have its own core shadow and reflected light, even though it's within the bowl. This one has the same. Each shape has its own shading to create its own form. Remember to use the direction of the shading, those contour pencil marks, directional shading marks, to make it look more dimensional. Your pear, it's almost like two circles put together because there's going to be a highlight up here on the top roundness and then another highlight over here where it kind of curves back out and is hit by that light source again. You're going to have shadows underneath each of your objects. For these, I made my pear, and this is just a personal choice, I made my pear look like it might be a lighter value. Maybe it's a light green, and this is a darker red apple. So the values are going to be different because of the original color of the objects themselves. Oops, sorry. So then we have our little tablecloth or napkin or dish towel or what have you underneath, and I really want you to think about how these folds are going to have individual highlights and shadows to make them look three-dimensional. There's shadow underneath the bowl where we've shaded in. So again, take your time and show understand how to turn these abstract shapes of circles into cylinders or circles into spheres and, rectangles into cylinders, so that you know how to turn those into something more applied, more realistic. Please let me know if you have any questions. Take your time and do a good job so that you get that practice and build these skills to be a better artist.